Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter at JamesRosenFNC. In what seems like a period of endless conflict, it often occurs to me to ask, who really knows what happened in a war better? Is it the uniformed officer who's moving things around on a map in an office somewhere, who gets the great overview of the war? Or is it the soldier whose combat boots touch the ground and who sees firsthand the effects of war? No one is better positioned to answer this question than our next visitor to the Foxhole. Michael Waltz is the author of Warrior Diplomat, A Green Beret's Battles from Washington to Afghanistan, published by Potomac Books this past November. He is now a lieutenant colonel in the Special Forces Reserves. He is also a senior national security fellow at the New America Foundation. Formerly, he was a commander of a special forces company, counterterrorism advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, and director for Afghanistan policy, Office of the Secretary of Defense. Michael Waltz, welcome to the Foxhole.
Oh, thanks so much.
So when were you in Afghanistan?
I was in Afghanistan multiple tours, but primarily in 2005, 2006 as we transitioned the effort to NATO, and then most recently in 2009, 2010, where I had responsibility for the Special Forces in eastern Afghanistan on the Pakistani border, and many, many trips with the private sector, and then in my civilian government capacity from a policy standpoint in between.
So you've been to these places in fatigues and in wingtips?
That's right. That's right, yeah. Great way to put it. I mean, I've been there in a suit, I've been there from the private sector, and I've been there with literally boots on the ground.
Having traveled there over such a long span of time, what's your sense of how Afghanistan is doing if we were to look back on it from the days when it was controlled by the Taliban,
right,
and the American campaign began in October of 2001? Is it on an upward arc today? Is it better off than it was before our intervention? Tell me about the state of Afghanistan.
Yeah, so, you know, the underlying theme that I think you'd hear from me or anyone else who's really had their head in our effort in Afghanistan in the last 13 years is the issue of time. And you know, Afghanistan is certainly better 13 years on, better off, more stable, and on a more positive trajectory than it was when we first started in 2001. That said, that trajectory is fragile. It could easily be reversed. There are simmering ethnic tensions between the major ethnic groups. The regional players, Pakistan and Iran, namely, are still heavily involved, many times in unhelpful ways. And it's essentially a very fragile state that al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and others could easily return to in the wake of what's, right now at least, our withdrawal policy, and that's what has me most concerned. So, you know, if you take a long view and you look at efforts that have been successful over time, South Korea, Japan, Germany, you see the constant theme that the United States remained engaged for decades, not just a matter of years.
But those other conflicts you just mentioned, were they counterinsurgency exercises?
Not all of them were. I think you could also argue that because of our immediate engagement that they didn't turn into insurgencies, which they easily could have. But they were certainly nation-building exercises that I think have borne fruit. If you look at the case of South Korea in particular, a lot of people don't realize that South Koreans were more illiterate. There was a higher illiteracy rate in the 1940s and 50s than there are in Afghanistan today. So I think there's ways to do it and remain engaged in a sustainable way over time, where if you look at South Korea now, it's obviously the 12th largest economy in the world.
Is religion one of the, or ethnicity, I guess you would say, tribal, right? Is the governing factor here, right, in the sense that some would say that, and I'm not advancing this argument, right, but we hear it stated that Muslims are just not ready for democracy in a place like Afghanistan. Your own experience tells you what about that?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, we can just look at the case study of Turkey. We can look at Indonesia. I mean, there are cases of Muslim-dominated countries that are dominated by the Muslim religion that have moved into the 21st century economically and politically that have been relative success stories. But, you know, but we are fighting, and we shouldn't deny the fact that we are fighting around the world, and particularly in Afghanistan, Islamic extremism and a bastardized form of that religion. And it's an ideology that's going to take a very long time to defeat, and the comparison that I make is to the ideologies of communism to the ideologies of fascism. And if you look at the timeline there, again, back to that theme, we're talking 50, 60, 70 years. I think our civilian leadership owes it to the American people to begin talking about what we're facing in those terms.
And is our civilian leadership right now, in the person of President Obama, properly framing what we're trying to combat and overcome when he calls it violent extremism as opposed to Islamic extremism?
Right. Yeah. So the short answer is no. I don't think they are. And what you often hear is what you were getting to a minute ago, that Afghanistan's too hard. There's fractious tribes. There's fractious ethnic groups. The Islamic religion isn't meant for democracy, what have you. We can talk for the rest of the show about how hard it is. I would argue we really don't have a choice. What advocates of President Obama's withdrawal policy can't do is say, well, what do we do when al-Qaeda is resurgent? And we're talking now in Afghanistan and Pakistan about an area that has nuclear weapons, which I think raises the stakes even further than what we've seen with the resurgence of ISIS in the wake of our withdrawal in Iraq.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is Michael Waltz, author of Warrior Diplomat, A Green Beret's Battles from Washington to Afghanistan, published by Potomac Books in November. He is a lieutenant colonel in the Special Forces Reserves, a senior national security fellow at the New America Foundation. Formerly, he was a commander of Special Forces Company, counterterrorism advisor to the Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, and director for Afghanistan policy at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Which Secretary of Defense?
For both. I was there for the transition between Rumsfeld and Gates.
Very different men.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I'm very proud to say I've received Secretary Gates' endorsement on the book. It's one of the only ones that I know that he has done. Yes, very different view, particularly in terms of our engagement. The kind of the theme as it pertained to Afghanistan under Secretary Rumsfeld was, we've won, we've defeated al-Qaeda, we need to maintain a light footprint so that we're not mistaken for, if you remember when the Russians were there, right, as occupiers. And we saw, and I was there both on the ground and back in the Pentagon when we kind of saw the shift of resources to the Iraq invasion. Under Secretary Gates, there was a realization that things were not going as well as they should in Afghanistan, that our NATO partners that we had handed the effort over to were not stepping up to the plate, frankly, both politically and militarily, and that we needed to re-engage.
What do you make of the new leadership in Afghanistan right now, President Ghani?
Well, I think we both have President Ghani and we have Abdullah, the leader of really seen as the leader of the Northern Alliance. Both are fine men. I've met and dealt with both personally, and that's in and of itself a positive move forward for the country. And both are looking to the United States for as its long-term partner and for long-term engagement.
In other words, there's a competition between these men, but you wouldn't say antipathy between them. But
what I worry about those in kind of the second and third tier behind them, the power players and power brokers and warlords that aren't getting what they need out of the government right now. There is some antipathy. Let's not kid ourselves. Okay. It'd be almost like having President Obama and Mitt Romney in the same White House and telling them to work it out. So there's a natural antipathy that goes back years and years. But I do think we have two men who are looking to the West as its long-term partner to move forward. So mixed view.
Who do you hope is the audience for your book?
A couple of folks. I mean, I've received the feedback I've received so far from special operators that were out on the ground has been incredibly positive in giving me feedback and basically saying, finally, someone said it. I talk a lot about the frustrations we experienced out on the ground. Back here in Washington, there's very high-level talks of troop numbers and what have you. I get into how we could have used the troops on the ground better. And more effectively in our strategy and our engagement. But I also want to talk to kind of your average American who wonders why the most powerful military in the world essentially has found itself in a tie 13 years on. And I think one of the reasons I wrote it is I was pretty uniquely positioned to do that, having literally in 2009 left the White House Situation Room and found myself out on the Pakistani border just months later to be able to talk from both ends.
What's your answer? Why is this colossus mired in something less than victory at this point?
Looking back, I think historians will agree we made three, maybe four kind of key mistakes. One was that we never resourced the war appropriately, and kind of important subsets of that are Iraq, and that's not a judgment on the Iraq war. Just no nation can fight two wars as well as it can fight one.
Of this scale.
Of this scale, exactly. The second subset of that, the resource issue, was outsourcing the effort to NATO, which wasn't prepared as an institution or individually. The other piece was really getting our arms around Pakistan. No insurgency or counterinsurgency in history that I know of has been successful when the insurgents have sanctuary next door. And then the third piece, which really is very prevalent still today, is announcing our withdrawal, as President Obama did in 2009, years in advance of the actual withdrawal, and the signal that sends to the enemy.
Point.
Yeah, and I was on the ground during his 2009 West Point speech, actually in my headquarters, when he made the announcement, and one of my officers said, "That's like Franklin Delano Roosevelt announcing D-Day, but then announcing its withdrawal. What do you think the Germans would have done?" And we saw immediate effects on the ground in pretty negative ways, and that are right now still playing out.
So, on that, if only on that basis, you don't take a very high view of Barack Obama as a commander-in-chief.
Well, I don't know. I think Secretary Gates said it best in his book, where President Obama as commander-in-chief implemented the strategy, but never truly believed in it. And that permeates itself throughout the entire national security structure. When at the top, coming from the White House, we have to be in this as an entire government, and when the president's not, it has a detrimental effect. Absolutely.
A staple of the literature of war, particularly the Vietnam literature, where an American finds himself spending a very long time or repeated tours of duty in a place like Vietnam, almost mandates that by the end of the story, the American has come truly to love the culture of this foreign exotic land, maybe taken a bride, etc. I'm sure you're familiar with the staples of the literature.
Sure.
Does any of that apply in your case? Did you come to love Afghanistan and its people and its food and its music and all the rest of it?
I almost died several times in Afghanistan, so that frankly still sticks with me. And I'm happy to have that conversation in terms of PTSD and the effects that it's having on our soldiers coming home. But yes, I still take care of the family of one of my Afghan army sergeants that was killed and died in my arms. Along the lines of, I truly believe that we are going to defeat Islamic extremism through education, through women's empowerment, and through taking care of one family and one village at a time and moving them to a better place. So I will be engaged in one way or another in Afghanistan the rest of my life.
Is that a clear build and hold type strategy in essence when you talk about going from one neighborhood or one village to the next?
It is in some sense, but I also think there's ways that we could do it with a much smaller footprint and a sustained but long-term engagement, not necessarily with U.S. soldiers occupying every valley and village in Afghanistan. I do think we can do it by, with, and through our Afghan partners, but to tell the world and to tell the region that we're going to do it by 2014 or by 2016, I think is going to prove to be a failed strategy.
And I was remiss in not asking earlier, but how serious were these brushes with death for you?
Well, I mean, in one case, as I said, the people in front of me and behind me died, and I was able to get them out. We were able to kill our ambushers, but I've since taken on the responsibility for their families, and taking care of them. So they're about as serious as you could get.
You write in Warrior Diplomat, Green Berets Battles from Washington to Afghanistan, and I quote now, "The efforts of my Special Forces teams to win the trust of local elders and the support of their tribal militias came to a crashing halt in December 2009. President Obama had announced the surge of U.S. forces at a speech at West Point. However, the show of strength and commitment delivered by the surge announcement was immediately undercut by the president, also announcing a date for its withdrawal. I distinctly remember being horrified as I watched the speech in my headquarters. He's just told the world we're leaving, my operations officer York exclaimed. Who the hell is going to risk their life to work with us now? Another officer watching with us compared the announced surge and then withdrawal to President Roosevelt announcing D-Day in June 1944, but then telling the Germans that the invasion force would leave a year later. What do you think the Germans would have done? Wait us out? He asked rhetorically. The United States could not have sent a worse message to the Taliban, the region, and the Afghan people, and we immediately felt the impact in the field. Out on one of the most remote borders in the world, the Mokbil elder we had been courting had somehow heard of the speech. He didn't even acknowledge the surge. He heard only America is leaving. Do you feel the same way about, let's say, an announcement by President Bush of the surge in Iraq in January 2007, where he announces not a withdrawal date, as President Obama did at West Point, but nonetheless exactly how many troops are going to be deployed? I find in watching commanders-in-chief from both parties, both administrations, that altogether too much information is disclosed about our war plans and our operations and exactly how many divisions or what have you we plan to send at a given time. Right. Who has any right to know that? Bob Woodward doesn't have a right to know it. James Rosen doesn't have a right to know it. The enemy doesn't have a right to know it.
Well, so I'd answer your question in two parts. Yes. On the one hand, I agree with you, and we're kidding ourselves if we don't think leaks that are so prevalent in this town hurt us operationally in the field. In
a military context.
In a military context, whether it is, and we know that Al-Qaeda and other groups have active cells that comb our newspapers looking for nuggets that they can begin reacting to and adjusting to. So in that sense, yes, it's somewhat detrimental. But in the bigger picture, what people out there in the region hear is the broader message. And what they heard from President Bush was, we are with you. We are there until we're successful. We are with you for the long haul.
The goal is victory.
And the goal is victory. And everyone believed that was the case. And now what everyone hears, despite they don't hear 10,000 troops or 20,000 troops or those details that you're rightly concerned about, what they hear is we're leaving. Period. That whether it is 2014 or 2017, that the United States is going to turn its back on the region, and I think that's from Libya to Nigeria to Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. That's part of what you're seeing right now is the region spinning in the wake of American, or with the lack, frankly, of American engagement.
Do you think you'll ever run for office?
I'm not sure.
It's been contemplated?
It could be contemplated. I'd love to serve in government again. Who knows in what capacity, but it would truly have to be with a team that I believed in and could serve with.
My money's on you. You're a hero and a patriot, and I know I speak for everyone who will see this when we say we're grateful for your service.
James, if I could just say one more thing.
Please.
I'm giving all of the proceeds from this book to a veterans charity called the Green Beret Foundation. We do have a debt to the folks that have come home. I was fortunate enough to come home with all my fingers and toes. So the extent that we can help, I'm giving all the profits of the book to them.
Okay, very well done. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim.
Michael Waltz is the author of Warrior Diplomat, A Green Beret's Battles from Washington to Afghanistan. It was published by Potomac Books in November, and I commend it to every patriotic American. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of The Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, signing off from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter at JamesRosenFNC, and we will FNC you next time.